Being brought to you by the Portland Area Historical Society. The Portland Area Historical Society was formed following our 1969 centennial, when those of us who worked on the centennial realized that there were certain voids in the history of our town that could be researched. So in 1970, our Historical Society was formed. This presentation today, as I said, is from the Historical Society, and our presenter today is Harold Lakin. Harold Lakin is a lifelong resident of the Portland area, and today he is going to talk to us about some of the history of early Portland, especially as it relates to horse owners and horses, and how horses were used in work and in transportation.
We've talked a lot about the history of Portland area, and we've talked about people, places, but seldom have we talked about the means by which people made history. And one of those means is our horses that we had. Up until the advent of the automobile and the farm tractor, horses were very important in the economy and the social life of people in Portland, as it would be all over. It occurred to us some time ago that we ought to talk a little bit about the horses as they relate to the history of Portland. And I would like very much to review the horses. I do have some background. I spent a lot of my time, my youth, on a farm. I was raised in Portland, but I fell in love with a beautiful team of Persian horses, and it led me finally to a life on the farm. And from that time on, I've always had at least a lot of love for horses, if not too much connection. It led me through, as I say, the time all through high school, all through the grades, and into my college career, in which I became a member of the cavalry. It seemed like I was in some way related to horses all the way through. And then later on, as we moved back on the farm, we had horses to begin with before we had tractors. So it's been a sort of an adjunct to my career to have horses around. To start with, I'd like to point out that we had several different breeds of horses, different kinds of horses for different kinds of work. The main horse that we had were the draft horses. They did the draft work, the heavy work, the plowing, the fitting the ground, and the heavy traffic and draying in the cities. And we had those horses with Persian, as I mentioned before, were the mainstay of the horse population in Portland for a long time. Then there were, later on we had the Belgians come in and the Shires, and they all had a place sometime or other in the history of the horses in Portland. The draft horses were heavy horses. The Persian sometimes got as high as a ton in weight. And then we had a medium-sized horse, and they were the Morgans and the Hamiltonians. They were used to do a little work, a little heavy draft horse, but they were principally used for driving and riding. And then we had the rather light horses, the advent of the scarcity of horses during World War II, World War I, and the Army taking a lot of horses away from the community. The horse buyers from the Army came in and bought horses right and left, and some of the people, in order to satisfy the demand for horses, brought in Western Mustangs and Western horses. One of those importers, so to speak, was Henry Kenyon, who lived out in Chippewa, who brought in a whole train carload of Western horses and sold them around. They were a little bit difficult to sell because farmers just didn't want that slight of horse. but they had to have them because they needed the horsepower. And another figure in the horse history report I'd like to bring before I forget it is Fred Jarvis. Fred was a horse buyer and seller. He's a drayman. He was instrumental and identified with the horses in Portland. Fred was not only a horse lover and a horse dealer, he was a man around town, loved and was a humanitarian in many respects. Sometimes I think that Fred was quite instrumental in town and the history of town. People who couldn't borrow money, for instance, from the banks of Portland, could borrow money from Fred. And I had the privilege of looking at some of his journals and his books, and I noticed quite a few times that people would borrow up to $50, sometimes $100 from Fred, and Fred could do it to people that couldn't get money to bank. And I'm sure Fred did a real service to Portland, Ionia County. And later on, Fred became mayor of the city before he eventually died. Included with the horse world, so to speak, we had other economic development and concerns with horses, and a lot of people employed because of horses. Men that had to drive the horses, the men who had owned the drays, and in addition to that, we had veterinarians, and we had horse stables, feed barns, buggy makers, blacksmiths, shoed the horses and put irons on the wheels of the wagons that needed, and made bobsleds and all that sort of thing. So just because the horses were here doesn't necessarily mean that the horses were the only ones involved, because a lot of people were involved, and a lot of the economy of the country was dependent on horses and related to horses. I like to think of the time when we had horse doctors. At that time, the veterinarians were principally, well, we used to call them horse doctors. The term veterinarian was a little late in the history of Portland. Probably not until Dr. Griswold came to town did we start calling them veterinarians. Dr. Griswold was a well-educated man and had he used the word veterinarian in describing his work and given his title. Before that, everybody was a horse doctor. Several of those people were very prominent in Portland, of course. They doctored the horses. They did do very much doctoring of other animals, other farm animals, and none of them did any small animal doctoring. Mostly as horses, and horses had different kinds of ailments. I think of spavin, things that used to happen if they didn't get the right horse collar on, and they had the ring bone and the scratches and the fistulas, several different things that happened to horses, and colic and horse bots. All these sorts of things were common, and the heaves were very common. If you bought a horse back in those days, you had to be awful careful that you didn't have the heaves. There was a way you could doctor horses for a period of maybe a day, and they wouldn't notice the heaves. And then you'd buy a horse, and he wasn't heaving, and maybe up in a matter of a day or two, he had the heaves. And they're not much good when they had the heaves. They couldn't work. It just couldn't feel like a man having the present day emphysema of his lungs. A lot of things like that, and they were all more or less simple compared to what we think of today as veterinary medicine. I can think of Dr. Benedict was a very common name, and Doc was also a very community-minded man. He was coach of the football team for a good many years in Portland. And there's going way back, Dr. Harper used to come over maybe from Sunfield over here to do doctoring of horses. Besides that, we had, as I said, other community activities, businesses that are related to horses. We had harness makers. Wilhelm Harness Shop was very well known. They made beautiful harnesses, and they were very common to see farmers gather right there. I remember during Saturday nights they'd go into the Wilhelm Harness Shop. Then many years ago we had a buggy making industry in Portland, not large, but they did make buggies and wagons. They were run by a family by the name of Bauer and a layman. The late Leo Lehman's father was instrumental in the wagon making. Then in addition to that, part of the business of having horses around was somebody there to propagate the horse race. You had to have stallions. You had to have the mares bred so we could have new colts, fillies. And they were run by one prominent man that I can remember was Glenn Benjamin, who had a Shire. A Shire was a very, very important horse, draft horse. He also had a Hamiltonian that was a driving horse. It could be ridden. I don't remember any instances where we had ponies, stallion ponies, but we did have ponies around, a few of them around town. I can remember that the Emrys had a pony, very common around town, named it Buster. Buster, everybody knew Buster, and it was driven and ridden by the Emry family. The Pryors out east of town had ponies that they drove to town. There were a few scattered ponies around, Shetland ponies. They were playthings, more or less, because they're not big enough to work. Then I have to point out the fact that we had, up until about 1920, in the early 20s, horses were the dominant power, traction power. And then the tractor came in. At first, not well received by farmers because they said they couldn't. Nobody could get out and really do any work with tractors. They had steel wheels to pack down the soil, and you didn't have any equipment that could fit the tractors. They were very skeptical about accepting tractors. So the horses kept on as a dominant power on farms and in the city until the late 20s, when after a period of time when farmers commenced to make doodlebugs out of old cars, and they found that they could use tractors, and the doodlebugs had rubber wheels and rubber tires, and that helped so it wouldn't pack the soil. I can remember that a family by the name of Roach that lived west of town, as a matter of fact right across from our house here, he shifted from horsepower to tractor power by buying what they call a Bates steel mule. A Bates steel mule was just two sets of wheels with an engine in between, and you hooked on your farm horse-drawn equipment onto it, and you drove the machine with lines. The lines were hooked to levers, one lever for shifting of the tractor, another lever for the gasoline accelerating it. And you sent back on the plow like you would a horse, and you drove it like you would a horse. It didn't last very long before people just said it didn't work. Another thing, talk about the Rhodes family. The Rhodes so loved his horses, a good team of Morgans, a bay team of Morgans. And he loved very much. And when he finished farming, rather than have anybody else own those horses and abuse them maybe, he had a man in town take them out and shoot them and bury them. I always thought about that. That's the element in the love of horses, as demonstrated by Mr. LaRoche. I think in terms of the horses as they relate to the history of Portland, and I can't help but think that for a long time we had a certain amount of loyalty and attachment to horses. And I don't think we ever lost them. For a while, we didn't think too much about horses, and later on, with the Smiths being instrumental in this sort of thing, Marge will tell you that they started the riding horse enthusiastic group here in Portland. I can't tell you just when. Marge, you can say something about how you and Labe Smith, your husband, started a riding fund or recreation development in Portland. I think it'd be interesting to speak about that for a little while.
I guess I have to say, as I recall, I think that the riding club began at about early 1940s, and it was a very informal type of organization. The horses were, in most cases, just grade horses, and started out with just people getting together on Sunday for a pleasure of a ride of some kind and maybe a picnic. And as time went on, over the years, starting in 1940 and 50 and 60, people became more interested in upgrading the quality of horses that they had. So they moved from grade horses into registered Arabians and registered quarter horses, and occasionally a registered Morgan. And it was this group that started the rodeo and building the arena, which was in that valley area in back of TRW.
Mm-hmm.
And for 4 or 5 years, we had quite outstanding rodeos in this town, and people came from all over the Midwest to attend the rodeo. It's really a shame in a way that the arena is no longer there. But now the emphasis is on horse shows.
Mm-hmm.
And the Portland Riding Club has built a very fine arena over on Bogues Flats. And once a year on Labor Day, they have a large horse show.
Yeah.
And people come from Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and so on with their horses. And they come not only to get points, but there is a little monetary gain there, too.
Well, that just goes to show that we haven't forgotten horses entirely. They say today, and I have no way of checking it, that there are more horses in Michigan than there were back in 1910. But it's in a different kind of horses. It's, as Marge said, it's riding horses, horses for recreation mainly. I'd like to speak a little bit on the Morgan horse. The Morgan horse was developed in the Boston area by a man by the name of Morgan, and we don't know exactly how it all happened, but through his selection and breeding of horses, he developed what we always called a chunk, a medium-sized horse that was dual purpose. It was a good riding horse, a good driving horse, and it could do work. It could plow and it could drag, it could do all the things necessary, not to the extent that the big draft horses did, but it was a good universal type of horse. Well, it became my pleasure as a kid to have started a long time experience with a Morgan on a farm. I was introduced to farming when I was about 12 years old, and one of the first things, the first summer I was on the farm, we had to drive cattle from the Portland area clear to Sunfield, and we took a team of horses along, and one of the mares, a team of mares, and one of them had a colt, and the colt was just becoming a year old and just ready to be ridden. And I asked and got the permission to mount the mare colt filly, and that became starting of a relationship with a mare colt called Bird. Bird finally became our family, my own family's chief form of recreation when we moved back to Portland after I was married and had a family. Bird was loaned or given to me, to the family, and we kept her around for several years here. And I think of this so many times. Bird never broke out, and she never got away from our place. She was, we worked her, we cultivated with her, we drew logs, the kids rode her. She was a boss of the herd of cattle we had. She just took over and bossed them, that's all there was to it. And very good keeper. Well, about one time she did break out, and she went back to her old stable about 2 miles away at the Rowe farm, and got into the barn, into her old stable, and was found dead in the morning by Mr. Rowe. I kept thinking, they say that elephants always return to their home base to die, and I keep thinking about Bird Horse, how she did that very thing here. She was 31 years old when she did this. Very old age for a horse. Different things, snatches of my reminiscence of the horses in Portland. I can remember that horses did die in Portland. You wonder what happened when a horse died. Well, somebody on a stone boat with a team of horses went to the place where the horse died, and they put him on a stone boat, which is a flat plank, piece of planking that had hooked up to the horses. And coming through town, down through the residential area, down through Main Street, across the upper bridge, usually across the upper bridge, here is a team of horses and a man driving them with a horse on a stone boat, a dead horse on a stone boat. The horses were taken one after the other, and over my childhood, I suppose I've seen as many as a dozen of these horses, a funeral, so to speak, for horses, and usually a bunch of kids traveling, walking on behind, very curious about the whole thing. There must be at least from a half a dozen to a dozen young fellows trailing behind, walking in the dust of the old stone boat, following the man drawing it up to down Market Street to about at the up Market Street, about where the pit, the sand pit is there now, and there was a horse cemetery there, and we used to watch the internment of these horses, the dead horses, and it was a common thing to be, not too common, but if you lived in Portland, a small town like that, ultimately you had the experience of seeing a horse funeral, and always stuck in my craw ever since. I've seen those as a kid.
Harold, do you remember the racetrack? I think it would be, I've seen it in the old maps of Portland. I believe it's on the east side of the Grand River.
I don't remember the one there. I remember that where the city complex is now, approximately where the filtration plant is, there was a set of buildings there with a street down through them, a set on the riverbank, and a set across the street on the west side of it. A kind of a street, like you'd say an old western town would have. And in this set of buildings was what I would say was a judge's stand. There was on the top story, the two-story building, there was an open sort of veranda up there, and a place that would be where a judge or judges would stand for races. And I do remember that it was said at that time that there was a racetrack there where it would be on the flats, on the boat flats. That much I can just remember seeing. A man by the name of Franks owned a place at that time, and these old weather-beaten buildings were there at the time.
Do you remember at that time in the history of Portland if Was there any objection to horse racing on Sunday?
I don't remember that, but I knew that there were horse racing.
Were the races
informal?
Usually, what time? What day? Or
Two probably young fellas and they're with buggies would start horse racing. They'd start just like they do now with automobiles. They start racing to see who had the better horse. But nothing organized. It was more or less well, like they do now with automobiles. A couple of guys challenge each other, you know, and they had those horse races. But mounted? No, I don't remember anything of mounted horses, except in high school. I rode a horse from the row farm to town to high schools over one season, I remember, and I used to get challenged by a few of the other fellows that rode horses. One of them was Lucinda Monroe, rode a horse to town, to high school. And I think one of the Carpenter boys rode a horse, and I don't know if I ever participated in a horse race, but I was challenged different times because of that. We had a lot of fun with horses. I had my father's business required that he have 3 teams of horses. The horses were used to go on the area around here, all of the country stores, Berlin Center, Tremaine's Corners, Sunfield, Mulligan, Eagle, all along the small stores, a lot of Collins was one, East Chippewa store, and pick up eggs and butter. He was in the commission business, and he had 3 teams of horses with wagons, and they went around and gathered these horses, this butter and eggs that were taken in on trade to the farmers. I can remember very well in the wintertime we had 2 drivers. One was a fellow named Peak, and the other was named Stringham. One of them couldn't bear to be out without having his feet all bundled up. He'd have socks and boots of all kinds. I wonder how the man could walk. He just had to have that. But he'd drive with common canvas gloves all day long. His hands never got cold, but his feet always got cold. The other man, Peak, by the name of Peak, just the reverse. He could go with his slippers on all day long driving that team of horses, but he had to have great big mittens on all that. I always thought to myself, what a difference there is in men, you know, because of those two occasions when they had that. Another instance that I remember well is that when they used to put up ice, they had a horse right out on the ice drawing something like a colorator with teeth on it that cut into the ice, and they'd cut the ice like that, and in blocks, and then they would have a horse. They had a thing that could draw that ice up to a place that went up to a chute that went up into the ice house. I remember very well. They had that on back of the library on a pond that they had there, and then of course the ice wagons in the summertime. We always had a bunch of kids trailing on behind, hoping to get a chip of ice now and then. And the men who usually run that would chip off some ice if they didn't, and they'd break off accidentally. They'd give us ice. I remember very well. And another thing that's very important, the horses, when you had groceries, when you wanted groceries, you called the grocery store and ordered them. And they were put onto a wagon, a delivery wagon with a horse on or a team. Usually owned by Curly Jarvis, or Fred Jarvis is his proper name was. We called him Curly. Usually run by an older boy, a high school boy probably, and a couple of young kids did the running. My brothers and I were part of those runners, and I remember we used to go on. But the horses did the job there. And we'd stop at Richard's store, Robinson's store, or Stone's store, and pick up groceries, and we had different parts of town that delivered it. Horses were there. And another important, observation I made, reminiscence I should say, was Alf Allen. Alf Allen was a dead ringer for President Taft. He had a big goatee or mustache, and he ran a plug hat, and he had a hack, we call it. It was a buggy arrangement, and he always met all the trains in town. And Alf Allen would call out as the people that left the train. He'd call out his that he had transportation to the Divine Hotel or into Portland, and he always had beautiful horses and drove what they call the hack back there.
Where was the depot?
The depot is right across from Builder's Lumber and Supply, right there. Well, I guess there's just one building left, the Builder's Lumber and Supply. I would call it a bargain store there. That's only part of it. It looked like a long ways over, across through the mud and the dust. It was just a dirt road into Portland down what they call, I think it's River Street or Market Street there now. But always there were horses there waiting for the picking up the freight, so forth like that.
Why would there be many passengers getting off the train there to come into Portland? What kind of business would those people have been in? Were they salespeople or?
What you call drummers. Drummers was well, they were actually, as I said, traveling salesmen. The only way they got from town to town, of course, was on the train. And we had 2 or 3 trains a day coming into Portland. And the drummers would come in, and of course Alf Allen would take them over to the main street over town and on Kent Street. And they would put up with at the hotel. The hotel had what they call a sample room. If he had a lot of samples he wanted to show, then a dray would bring those over, and ultimately some of the merchants around town would come down and see what the samples were that the drummer wanted to show them. They were quite a factor in the success of Hotel Divine and the success of this Alf Allen, who run the hack, so to speak, and the drayman. And actually, the goods were ordered. Of course, they came in on train, and from the train they had to go over town on drays. The drays are owned by various men around town. Leo Treeweiler was one who had a dray. Treeweiler also had a team of horses that subbed as they run the fire wagon too. And the minute that the fire whistle blew, Leo would run his horses to the fire barn, which is across from the city hall. And they'd hook onto on the fire wagon, and away they'd go to the fire. Horses were, if you want to go any place or do anything, you did it with horses back in those days. And not only in the days that I'm telling you about, when horses were important in the early pioneer days. Example, in my own personal reference, my great-great-grandfather Green, who homesteaded near Collins, went to, when he'd want something special, would go clear to Detroit with a horse, riding a horse, and with a horse and a pack horse. And at least once or twice a year, he'd take time to go down there, taking whatever products he had, probably maple sugar or something of this kind, and barter furs maybe for whatever was necessary where they couldn't produce at home. My grandmother said one time the first time she ever saw any white sugar was when Granddad Green packed a bunch of stuff he wanted to bring back in a barrel, in a wooden barrel, on his pack horse. And when he came home, when they unloaded, they found a few dregs of white sugar in the bottom of the barrel. And my grandmother said that's the first time she'd ever even thought of or heard of white sugar. It was in that time. And horses were, of course, important. And the people who came here, either by oxen teams or, well, by horses. Some came by river, of course, back in the old pioneer days, the early settlers. But horses there again, very important, and were used and kept and bred, and was a very important part of the community and development of our community here.
Harold, do you remember the horse barn? I guess it was called a horse barn, that was sort of a cooperatively owned between the Congregational Church and the Baptist Church.
Yes,
I believe it was on Warren Avenue.
It was on Warren Avenue, and it was a shed.
Mm-hmm.
And when you came to church, you drove the horses in the shed. I don't know how many horses really, but about where Mrs. Bywater,
that's right,
that area there had horse sheds for horses. I don't know what churches. I think it probably was originally Universalist Church and the Congregational Church probably had it.
Mm-hmm.
And it might have been some of the other churches too. Yes, I remember those. Ultimately, of course, they were taken over. Automobiles took over, and they were destroyed. Something torn down, I guess, by I think Dell Packard tore one of them down up there on Warren Street. Yes, I do remember those.
By the time you reached high school age, and we didn't have any busing at that time.
That's right.
Did some of the high school students still ride their horses to school and put them in the livery barns during that time in your life?
Yes, it did. I lived out west of Portland 2 miles, and the Shook girls who lived another 4 miles out drove a buggy and picked up the Melstead kids and came to town. And usually picked up a Kenyan girl, and if I was fortunate, I got a ride with them to come into town. Most of the time I walked, or as I said at one time, I did have occasion to. I had a use of the Emery riding horse and rode a horse into town. But there were kids coming from all around town and putting up in the livery stable, and quite good business for the livery people too, because all the high school kids and some grade kids drove buggies into town. Some of them rode, most of them were buggies, and they always were kind of cooperative. You picked up people on the way into town, and I was fortunate enough to ride with Frances Cook when she came into town, and saved me a chance of walking, although I did walk quite a lot of the time. But all around town, the people came in that way to come to high school.
I also understand, too, that some of the students who lived quite far out boarded in town.
Yes, they did.
They would have their parents bring them in on Sunday afternoon late, and they would board with folks in Portland.
They did.
Then go home on Friday night.
Yeah, they really had to do that because it was just too far, and the roads weren't always good, back in those old days. It was quite a chore in the spring to come down through the muddy roads into town, and in the wintertime to come through the snow. That reminds me of the fact that they used to have bobsleds. Farmers in the wintertime, of course, changed from wagons to sleighs, and it was a very common thing for the kids around town to jump bobs, as we call it. We'd jump bobs and ride out in the country, maybe quite a ways, and we didn't know we'd ever get back again, but finally somebody would come back the other way going into town, and we'd jump their bobs and go in there. Once in a while, one of the farmers didn't like it, and they'd horsewhip us until we got off. But generally, they were quite congenial and didn't mind us riding on a bob. I wanted to mention one thing. The conversion from horse conveyances to automobiles created quite a concern among farmers who, the drays, these sleighs were narrower than the automobiles, and when the automobiles finally got to of some importance, they would make ruts in the road out wide, and then when you try to come down through there with a wagon or a buggy or a sleigh especially, you just couldn't track in the same tracks as the automobile. And one of the things that the blacksmiths used to do was the farmers would come in and they'd widen the sleighs. They widen out the tracks of the sleighs so that they'd conform to the width of the automobiles. The automobiles had a standard width of maybe 4 or 5 feet. I don't know just what it would be now. And of course the sleighs are narrower. I remember an old peddler at the Russman blacksmith shop. He had a wagon, cart that he traveled all through the country with goods on it he sold to the housewives. And it was narrow. And he was very, very perturbed. And I remember how he swore because of the darn way the roads had changed. And he spent 2-3 days or more, as I remember, at the Russman blacksmith shop, widening his cart so the wheels would conform to the width of the automobile. And before he could go, and he disappeared. He went across to the country, but he was a peddler. Another thing that used to happen quite a time was in the country. I said we used to peddle groceries in town, but in the country we had a Patterson store, both here and in the east in Collins, and we did have one here in Portland too. The Havens family were on a grocery route among the farmers. Groceries and other things, and it was done by horses. And the mail was always carried by horses. I think you have a picture here of a mailman with his buggy all enclosed, much like some of the Amish people have now. Buggies all enclosed, and usually so that you could put a lantern in it, and it would keep you warm while he was driving. The mail was carried by horses, and a typical arrangement was what you see here in the picture: a buggy that was enclosed, and so that it could the driver could stay inside with maybe a kerosene lantern in there to keep it warm. Or he had a soapstone that it was common among drivers in the wintertime. A soapstone was a piece of stone that was heated on a stove, and then it carried out to the buggy and put down on the floor so you could have your feet warm.
Well, do you, it seems that in the 100-year column that I read in the Sentinel Standard, very often they're talking about a horse that ran away.
Yeah.
And occasionally people were getting quite badly hurt. Yeah. Do you remember some of those kinds of situations in Portland? And
I well do, and one of the thrills of the days was a horse, was a runaway. And what do we mean runaway? I mean, horses were on a dead run, hooked to a wagon or a buggy or something like that, and usually the driver tried to stop them, but just nothing could do to stop them, wasn't anything. Usually they could be stopped sometime by running another wagon or a buggy or a horse close by them and corral them, but usually wound up disastrous. Usually the team would be hurt. The wagon would or buggy, whatever was hooked to them, would be destroyed, at least badly damaged, and quite often the driver was thrown off the wagon and hurt. I don't remember any deaths that occurred. I do remember that at times there have been accidents with horses. Horses, as I said, we all loved horses, but sometimes there were horses that were had a mean streak, so to speak, and they kicked. A prominent farmer east of town, was kicked in the stomach and finally died. These things happen different times. A fellow by the name of Wright, who traveled a stallion, a big Persian stallion, bought the stallion at a very reasonable price, almost given to him, because the stallion was a man killer. And this old man Wright said he cured the man-killing instinct of the stallion by throwing him down on his side and then walking up and down on the upside of the stallion, shooting a shotgun. And he did that several times until the horse was cured of his man-killing instincts. I remember that. There were times when we had runaways, and very much, a thrill, so to speak, but a very exciting, I should say, time for everybody when they had a horse runaway. Of course, some horses would break loose from their pastures or their barns, and they'd be at loose around town, but they didn't cause too much trouble. You might wake up with a horse looking at you through the window in the morning once in a while, but that was just a simple little scare is all. Yes, horses did run away, and not too often. I can only remember maybe half a dozen runaways. One was a team of mules. I didn't mention mules. We didn't have many of them in Portland. There were a few that I think somebody probably brought in from the West or something. I had experience with on the farm with a span of mules. I didn't drive them because we happened to have a Kentuckian working for us at the time, and he was driving a big team of Persians. But when we brought the mules in, he opted to drive the mules, so I got to drive in the Persians, which pleased me very much. But I remember that the mules used to run away. They were scared of everything you could think of. They couldn't get them close to a thrashing machine. Somebody shot a gun anywhere near them, they panicked, except for old Joe Mule. He was a gray dappled mule. I used to cultivate with him, and I always remember that Joe, at noon, whether the whistle blew or not, of course we're out in the country, you couldn't hear the whistle, but at noon, for some reason or other, he always stopped and brayed. And that meant that no matter where you were, in the middle of the field or not, you turned right around the row and went back to the barn. And Joe wouldn't go any farther than that. And he knew when it
was time to eat.
He knew when time was to eat. One thing I learned about mules was you could work them hard all day long, and turn them out into the barnyard and let them roll a couple times and go right back to work again. It seemed like they rejuvenated just by rolling around on that. And a mule never floundered. He never drank too much cold water. Matter of fact, I don't know anything ever happened to a mule that made him sick or anything. He's pretty darn sensible. They used to use horses in the artillery in the armory because mules are too darn smart. They wouldn't go into the war area, combat area. They were scared of guns, fire, and everything else. The mules were, but horses didn't pay any attention to it, so they always used mules. We never had too much experience around Portland. We used to have a pair. I think Fred Jarvis had a pair of what they call Missouri sugar mules. They were the bigger, heavier ones, but most of them were light mules. I don't think that in my experience is more than maybe 2 or 3 spans of mules around town. They were not popular. I guess you had to live back in those days to appreciate everything that went around. I think there was more attachment to the sources of our power, more sentimental attachments than they are to our present internal combustion motors and so forth, as far as of a source of power that was furnished us by horses, and that was the so-called sweep. If you didn't before we had belt power, even you had a way of hooking the horses to a sweep. In other words, a pole that turned the gears. One end of the pole told the gears in the center of the circle, and the horses were led around. Usually, they just started them off, and they kept going and going around and around and around. And in that process of going around, they turned the gears that would run some of the machinery that they needed. They used to use it for thrashing sometimes. They used it for, cutting up fodder, fodder cutter, different things like that. And even in moving buildings, they had a sweep that horses, what do you call it, capstan, with ropes and chains on it, and by driving the horses around and around and around, they would move a building very slowly, but surely. They moved the buildings. These were different ways in which you converted horsepower to the mechanical power that was necessary. They say that they had treadmills for horses, but I've never seen one of those. They would be used to do light mechanical work around the farm, usually. All of this was a way of reducing man labor and the burdens that men had. So horses are very important in our history. I'd like to speak one farther. I keep thinking every time I think of horses, I have to go back and think of Gwen Jarvis. Gwen Jarvis is a horseman. He was probably the only man in town that could deal with gypsies. Gypsies would come into town once or twice a year with a flock of, we used to say, skinflint horses, horses that were doctored up or old and decrepit in some way or other. And I always tried to trade them off, and were successful in some cases. But whenever they came to town and somebody told them, or Fred Jarvis showed up, they quickly moved on because they knew Fred had the business of horse trading pretty well under control, and the gypsies didn't have much chance. Very seldom did a gypsy have a chance to put anything over on the people in Portland. I'd like to, I remember we had purebred Perchins. We were very interested in getting purebred Perchin mares, and we were bought those from a family by the name of Coe over at Ionia. He was a Buick dealer, and he owned a farm south of town. It's right by Myers 50 acres there, right across the road. And he had Perchin mares, and I remember the first purebred team of Perchins that we had in our neighborhood came from the Coe family that were very prominent in the breeding of horses, and especially the Perchins. We had a Shire, a pair of Shires, and we didn't like them too well. We got rid of them just within a year or two after we had them. They were big-footed, and they just didn't fit into our operation, and we sold those. But mostly we had Perchins and Morgan Perchin cross. We had Perchins were dapple gray, very beautiful horses, who became white after they were aged, and mostly black and some tans. The Shires were tan horses, tan-colored horses. And the Western horses that came there were all colors. They had the paints, they call them, and they could be white and gray and black and all colored like that. I forgot to mention the fact that when we were converting when the tractors seemed to come in to threaten horsepower, farmers started to use multiple hitches. In other words, having just a team of horses or 3 horses. They used to have 3 or 4 horses, 8-horse team in tandem, and would have, instead of 1 bottom plow, they'd go to 2 bottom plows or 3 bottom plows. The idea was, the tractor people said, look what you can do with tractors. You can pull 2 bottom plows or 3 bottom plows. And the horse people said, well, we can do the same if we change. And Michigan State University, Michigan Agricultural College at the time, put on quite a few demonstrations, what they call multiple hitches. And in doing this, they thought they could compete and keep the tractor out. But the thing that happened that corralled the whole business was the fact that they put tractors on rubber. They spiked treads on tractors that compacted the soil so much, were done away with, and the tractors put on rubber. And the rubbers could be run up and down the roads. And so that probably was a death knell as far as horses were concerned. And of course, World War II was quite a stimulus to tractor production and tractor use. I don't think any place should really go far in the history and development of the economy and the lifestyles of people without some consideration to horses. And I would hope that other historical societies around the state will take a look at what the horses meant to them, as we have here in Portland. I guess that's about it, unless you've got Main Street, Portland, or Kent Street, at approximately where the traffic light is on Grand River Avenue, looking south down Kent Street. I think it'll probably be about 1910 in the wintertime, and it shows some of the horses. They were not allowed to hitch horses on Kent Street. They were allowed, of course, to come in and pick up whatever they had to pick up, or to deliver whatever they had to pick up. But the hitching post, so to speak, where they could leave horses during the day, where if they're not in a feed barn or livery stable, then it was on Back Street. And Back Street was lined, or Maple Street was lined on both sides, now where the sidewalk is. And they had hitching posts, rail, matter of fact, all along there. Then if you had, you usually had in front of your house or your business place, a steel or iron post, and sometimes made of stone, but it had a eye on the top of it where you could hook the horses to them. And besides that, would have at a convenient location a block of stone where you lighted from the buggy. If you brought your buggy up close to it, and you lighted onto that, and could go where we wanted to go. But they had the old hitching post, and I think there's one in town, and I believe, Marge, you have that, don't you? A hitching post. I don't know where you got it from.
It was on Maple Street years ago.
It was on Maple Street, yeah. And I remember that the horses were slanted downhill toward their front. They would paw the ground, and that's all dirt then. They would pound those, would paw the horses until they had a hole dug there, and the horses would always slanted down like that toward the hitching post. And the buggy, of course, would be out there. And on a Saturday, especially, a Saturday afternoon, it would be full of wagons and buggies, and sometimes single horses hooked up there. That was true all down Maple Street from Grand River to Academy. You'd have those up, and then there were hitching posts more or less on the south end of Kent Street, about where the City Hall is, on in there. But on the between Bridge Street and Grand River, they didn't allow horses to stand all day long there. As I said, you could drive up to the store and pick up your groceries and go, but you couldn't tie your horse up there all day long. You had to go on back street. It was very interesting on a Saturday afternoon there, because everybody came into town to do the trading and hook their horses up on back street. This carried over until the time when they had the automobiles and finally the pavement in Portland, and up to about 1935, it was very common for people to come in on Saturdays and do their shopping and park their automobiles and do a lot of visiting. As I said before, Wilhelm's harness shop was a very important and common place for men to meet, along with Barton's implement store and Banfield's furniture store was another place that people come. But mostly they were on the streets, talking and visiting with each other.
Okay. Harold, doctors were very particular about their horses, and they had to have reliable horses, and sometimes doctors hired drivers to get them out to see their patients. Do you remember?
Yes, I do, Marge. In fact, I was a driver once or twice for Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen kept his horse up on back of his house there on Academy Street, as was occasion by a lot of people in town having, if they had horses, they had a barn and a loft and a barn for the hay, and usually sometimes they had a cow to furnish the milk for the family. But there were a lot of horse barns back in those days. There's still some in town. I think the Allen, Dr. Allen horse barn is still there on the street, on the alley off from Academy Street. Dr. Alton had a horse barn, and in the early days he had a horse that he drove himself mostly, but later on he had a lady by the name of McNeil do his driving for him. Dr. Martin, who lived up where the City Hall is now, and where the brick addition there, it was a paddock. And Dr. Martin had his own horse there in the horse barn where the fire barn is now. And he was a younger man, and he did most of his own driving. Dr. Alton, I said, had a driver. Dr. Allen, in his later years, had a driver. Dr. Bradfield came later, and I don't remember that Dr. Bradfield had a horse. I suppose in the wintertime he did, but he did have a car, one of the first cars in Portland, an old Regal car, Dr. Bradfield. But Dr. Bradfield was a rider, a horse rider. He always, whenever we had a parade in town, he was the head of the parade, the marshal, so to speak. I remember very distinctly he used to sit on the horse and drive up there. He had some experience in the Army, and back in those old days, as a matter of fact, up until World War II, all officers in the Army had to learn to ride. And Dr. Allen, Dr. Bradfield, I don't know what branch of the Army he was in during World War I, but anyway, he was capable of riding, and as all officers were at that time. And I used to say, boy, someday I wished I could be the man that could be the field marshal of the parade, but I never got to be, of course. I did have experience in the cavalry. Had a lot of experience with horses. Matter of fact, won a horse show back in 1926 as a cadet horse show at Michigan State University. All he said wasn't that I won it. I thought a little horse I had, a little Morgan horse by the name of Joe. Joe was a perfect gaiter. He had a perfect walk, trot, canter, and charge or run gait. And I guess most anybody could have won. At least I did. He could jump, and I said he was had a perfect gait. All gaits are perfect, and you're supposed to have, if you could start with a trot or a canter or a walk or a run, you could accomplish a mile in a certain distance, a certain time. And on night rides we had down there, I would win those hand down because Joe had perfect gait. And I would ride Joe out on night rides and get lost. We'd get out and get lost and see if our horse could bring us back to the stable, and Joe always did. And that just demonstrates the attachment that a person can have with horses. And I don't know whatever happened to Joe. Of course, he became fox meat someday or other, but I always remember that Joe horse that I had in the cavalry.
Yeah, just kind of.
Well, what we tried to do was to bring out another facet of history. Man had created history, but not alone. He had resources. He had ways of getting places to accomplish things, and he had the power to do it. And in our case that we've demonstrated here has been the horsepower, the attachment that man had with horses, and the importance of horse in the development of history. If we hadn't had the horse back when we did, history would have been delayed, maybe never accomplished in many cases. Civilization advanced because of the horse, as it has probably with the internal combustion engine now that we have it. Horses still are playing an important part in our life and our lifestyle. As I said before, probably we have as many horses today in Michigan that we ever have had, but for a different purpose. We're using them for recreation now. I'm very proud of the fact and very happy that I had a close relationship with horses over these years, and was able to show you what it meant to Portland, the development of history in Portland. Okay.
Thank you, Harold Lakin, for the story that you've given us today as it relates to the early history of Portland and the importance of the horse and the horse industry to Portland. For those of us who are old timers, you have brought back memories and reminders. And for those of you who are part of the listening audience who are too young to know about this part of our history, I feel very certain that you have found this interesting and perhaps have filled some voids in the history of our community. Thank you for listening.